From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. We're with Times reporter Harriet Alexander, and she's off on a curious reporting trip.
It's Tuesday morning, 9:43 a.m., and I am driving through eastern Tennessee, through the Blue Ridge Mountains, part of the Appalachian Mountains, and I am on my way to a small place called Elizabethton. It's a town of about 14,000 people. It's pretty remote and pretty rural. But despite that, I am going to talk to some students and their teachers because they are really up to something that I think is quite remarkable.
A 40-year-old murder mystery appears to have been solved with the help of a Tennessee high school sociology class.
New research from Tennessee high school students shows a single person could be responsible for a string of killings, known as the Redhead murders.
For years, authorities thought it might be the work of a serial killer. The theory, though, was never proven. But now amateur detectives are trying to change that.
How did a group of teenagers manage to crack a case that had stumped police for decades?
I mean, you sit around for a few years and you think, gosh, these kids are awesome. They're much further along than I was at their age.
Once we got to that point, we were like, okay, this is no longer about the grade. Like, this is serious and this is real.
It's now even going to be an Amazon MGM movie. The story today, the high school class that found a serial killer and freed an innocent woman from prison.
My name is Harriet Alexander, and I am a senior features reporter for The Times based in New York City.
This is a wild tale you have for us today. When did it first come on your radar?
So what happened was, in March, there was the announcement that police in rural Tennessee had identified the body of a woman who had been killed 40-odd years before. And, you know, that's the kind of story that, of course, is very much of interest to local media, but not something that would really get national attention. But what we then discovered was that behind that revelation was a really, really quite incredible story. Because it turned out that this whole process began with a class of high school students who were set the task of trying to crack some cold cases, and they actually did.
Incredible. And this is a little town in Tennessee, isn't it? And you went to go and check it out. What did you find? What's the town like?
It's a beautiful spot. I mean, it was lovely actually going there. It's remote, it's rural, it's about 5 hours from Nashville. They told me, I couldn't believe this, that it's actually as close to Detroit and the Canadian border as it is to Memphis because of the structure of Tennessee. Tennessee is 9 hours from one end to the other. And this is in the far northeastern corner in the hills. It's a very pretty little place, but it's a very quiet little place. And it's certainly not somewhere that you would think, gosh, this is definitely a hotbed of crime or, you know, a den of super sleuths.
Well, you go to find the super sleuths at this high school. Tell us about the teacher who's leading all of this, Mr. Campbell.
Yes, that's right. So his name is Alex Campbell.
She really was one of the best students I ever had.
Oh,
That's
cute.
true.
One of the best teachers.
I tell her that. She just feels like
Actually,
she has to say
no,
that.
that's not true.
I'm your best student, let's be for real.
Well, I can't really make that conclusion until after we graduate. So
He's one of those people that you just think, my goodness, you really are a gift to the teaching profession. He's a wonderful teacher who really seems to inspire his students.
she's one of my former students.
Yes.
This is when you know you've been teaching too long.
Yeah.
So when your students grow up, go to college, and then come back and teach, and then you're like, oh,
Yeah, now we're coworkers, isn't that crazy?
I'm getting kind of old.
I wouldn't say that.
He's taught at this town, Elizabethton, for almost 20 years. He's 46. And he had a sociology class that he had to teach, so he had to stick to the curriculum. But he also was looking for an interesting way of capturing his students' imagination. And that's when he came upon the cold case idea.
So, I mean, I had been learning more about project-based learning. I've been trying it in class. I've been doing some things. And I thought, let's just start from the very first day and make the entire class's learning revolve around this one experience, you know. And so, kids do get interested. When you walk in and say, we're going to try to find a serial killer this year, that's a lot better than, let's look at the syllabus or, let's open to chapter 1. So I think it did build some excitement, but it also, there was a challenge.
And so he announces this idea to his students. This is what they're going to be doing in their sociology class. What did they make of it?
Well, I actually met some of the students who were in this first class. This was back in January 2018, so a few years ago. They said that they chose the class because they knew that the teacher had a reputation for being quite fun, quite imaginative, interesting, and they thought it would just be quite an unusual and interesting class.
During junior year is where I was really hanging out with my friends, outside of school and doing some things I wasn't supposed to be doing as a kid. But I don't know. I mean, I picked it because they were like, dude, you're going to like Mr. Campbell. You're going to like Mr. Campbell. I was like, he's so funny and he's so loud. And he was like, that sounds like something I need to be a part of. So I get in there and then he just comes in, slams the door and starts yelling. And I'm like, oh my God, this is going to be the best class ever.
One of the students, he said that he sat there in class and Alex Campbell wrote on the board, how do you find one person in 300 million? And they all thought about this for a little bit, and then he started talking to them about some of these concepts of sociology, about profiling somebody, about knowing about their background, about getting a sense of a person, how you could perceive them, how they were judged. And they got really, really riveted on this idea. And he was then leading them to this idea of it being a cold case.
We're going to do something different this time around. There is a 40-something-year-old cold case that nobody has been able to solve, and we're going to do it. And I was like, okay, this guy's a lunatic.
But I think that was quite classic of his teaching style. One of them told me that he remembered when they were learning about the First World War, he made them make paper mache gas masks.
Vividly, for World War I, we just pretty much, if you were in this class, you made this kind of game with all of the students called gas attack. So of course in World War II,
I remember
so everybody would make their own mask, their own paper mask. And every time Mr. Campbell would yell gas attack, you would have to put your mask on.
He would travel up to the lunchroom to freak all of the students out to go, yep, gas attack. And everybody would be, all of the students would be scrambling. It's just it's so interesting.
Oh, it's fun.
You could have been anywhere in the school and he would have done that, like the library. He would be like, gas attack.
That's so funny. Oh, wow.
Another of his students told me in great depth about the causes of the rise of the Nazis and the Second World War. So his teaching methods are really effective, and the students knew that they were in for something quite unusual.
So how did they actually get going on this cold case idea then? How did they pick a case and what did they do once they had?
What Alex Campbell did was he presented them with a series of cold cases from the local area, from Eastern Tennessee in the 1980s. And they looked at these murders. There were dozens of them. And they started going through newspaper clippings, looking at the internet. And they found as much details as they could on these women. There wasn't a lot on some of them. And they found that there was actually a real pattern, that it was women with red hair, aged in their 20s, 30s mainly. They died by strangulation, and their bodies were dumped along the highways, along the interstates across the area. So once they had a picture of these 6 women who fit the pattern, that's when they started looking at who could actually be behind that.
And how on earth do they go about doing that? Because that sounds like the easy bit, piecing together all the similarities in those cases, but then working that back into who the suspect could be, tricky.
So what they started to doing, and actually they enlisted the help of a FBI agent who was based in Knoxville, Tennessee. He was a friend of one of the parents, and he came to their class to talk to them about what the FBI does in terms of behavioral analysis to build up a picture of criminal mindset, criminal psychology. So they started to talk about who could be behind this. And a really key fact in the case was the fact that the bodies were dumped alongside the interstates. And I spoke to the FBI agent, and he said he was really sort of encouraging them, think, who is on the interstates? Why were they all along the road? And one of them said, it could be a truck driver. And the FBI agent, Scott Barker, he said that for him was bingo. That was the light bulb moment when they all started to think, oh, okay, we've got to think logically about who this person could be. So they built up a 17-point profile of this man. They termed him the Bible Belt Strangler because they decided that you need a sort of catchy name for your suspected killer. And they decided that he was potentially a lorry driver. They looked at the way the women were killed. They figured he was right-handed. They thought he was intelligent. They thought he was quite strong, muscular. They believed that he was Caucasian. That's just because of the makeup of that rural area. Heterosexual and probably from a troubled home. They figured that he had likely an absent father and a domineering mother. And this was because of a lot of the research that they had done into the profile of serial killers. So they had this idea of who this man could be.
Absolutely amazing. So then what do those 17 points, did you say, what do they then do with that? I mean, who can they tell?
Well, then they sort of hit a wall, really. They had the profile of this person who they believed was the Bible Belt Strangler, and they had the stories of these 6 women of how they died, but they didn't have the identity of these women, and they didn't have the identity of the person who killed them.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
So they actually decided to hold a press conference.
It is my privilege and honor to welcome you to our press conference. My name is William Bowers, and I'm a part of Mr. Campbell's sociology class.
Coming up, the student sleuths appeal to the public for information and have a breakthrough. That's in a moment. Harriet, if I think of some of the boring sociology style classes I sat through when I was growing up, it makes me wish that I grew up in Tennessee. You've been telling us about this class of teenage sleuths led by their teacher, Mr. Campbell, who have been working on a decades-old cold case and actually managed to piece together lots of victims, come up with a profile of who they think the suspect was, and as you were just telling us, put this out to the public in a press conference. How did that go?
So I spoke to some of the students who were involved in this press conference. Mason Pearson, one of them, he told me that he bought a suit, his first suit for the occasion. And the main presenter was somebody called Will Bowers.
Many of you today are asking the same question. Why are we here? Why are we doing this? Why do we even care about this? Well, it starts 37 years ago when a man murdered an unknown woman and laid her body beside an interstate. 4 years later, 5 more women shared the same fate.
And they weren't sure how many people were going to turn up, but in the end, there was about 60 people who turned up. So local media, of course, who just were fascinated by this story, as well as law enforcement and members of the public. So they essentially told them what they had been working on for the past few months, and they appealed for help. They said, we want to find out who these women are, and we want to find out who killed them.
To this day, all cases remain unsolved, and we only know and we only know the identity of 1 out of 6 victims. So, we need the public's help. We need you to be aware of this case. We need you to share this case around with any info that we are giving you or what you already know. We need you to find people that may know something we don't. Then the people with this information should contact the police. There's no doubt that someone saw something and thought it was probably nothing or it's not that important. It could be something, whether big or small. It could lead to a big break.
And so what happened then?
Remarkably, after this case lying dormant for almost 40 years, suddenly tips started flooding in. And the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation really began looking hard at these cases that had lain dormant for decades. Of course, some of these tips were not of use, but they did manage to find one of the other victims. They identified a woman who was known as Tina Farmer. She was 21 and from Indiana. That was announced in December 2018. And that was the first breakthrough in this case in decades. And what was really important was that in the intervening years from her death, technology, of course, had advanced, and they were able to look again at her body and find DNA. And the DNA from her body matched that of somebody who was already known to the police. And he was Jerry Johns. He was a trucker from Knoxville, and he had an awful family background, and the pupil's profile was absolutely correct.
Amazing. So this case, 40 years old or so, as you said, solved essentially thanks to these students. I mean, what did they make of that news?
What did you guys feel, I suppose, firstly, when he was identified and when you realised
like
that
when
your
we figured
profile...
out his name?
Yeah, and your profile was ridiculously accurate.
Dude, when Mr. Campbell sent me that picture, dude, I lost my mind. I was like, yo, dude, we literally described this down to a T. Because we're like, he's not...
They were utterly blown away. I mean, the news spread like wildfire around their school, around their community. They said they just really couldn't believe it. And it was such a boost to them to know that their work had really resulted in something.
What about Jerry Johns then, this trucker from a troubled background? I mean, what happened to him?
Yeah, so sadly, the case in some ways was closed then because Jerry Johns had actually died in prison. He died in 2015, so 3 years before the students began their investigation. But that did indeed give them some more leads because they were able to look at him and look at why he was in prison. And it turned out that he had attempted to murder another woman, Linda Schalk, and that was in 1987. And she survived. Her story of survival is just astonishing. He was trying to strangle her, but she had the collar of her coat that was turned up and caught between the ligament and her neck. And she described in really, really graphic detail about what had happened. She was an exotic dancer who he picked up at a truck stop nearby. So she survived, managed to stumble out of the wood where he thought he had killed her, and she goes onto the highway. She flags down a truck that was passing. She was covered in blood. She was actually blinded by the force of what he had done, and she was blinded for 3 days afterwards. But she managed to talk to the police, and she had the presence of mind to describe this man, and they actually tracked him down because he was still driving her car. So he was arrested, and that's how he was imprisoned.
Amazing. And I guess all of that is just further evidence that the students nailed it with identifying him as maybe the person who did all those other murders. And yet, as you say, he was dead. So what did the students do with themselves? Because that's another brick wall, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting about this story is that the woman who survived it has actually become a key resource for the students. She hadn't spoken about it for 40 years. And, in that time, she got married and she never told her husband about what had happened to her. He has since died. But Alex Campbell, thanks to the students, they found her. And Alex Campbell rang her, and there's phone conversations. They made a podcast And Alex Campbell was speaking to Linda about her experiences.
But what he said, at the very last second, he wasn't. I said, "Are you going to kill me?" He said, "Yes, yes." I said, "Why?" He said, "You're a nuisance," and that was it.
Seeing as the suspect is now dead, as you said, they actually would like now to see him not prosecuted because he's dead, but they would like to see a grand jury convened, which means that the prosecutors would essentially say to the grand jury, this is the evidence we have against him. If he were alive, would he be charged? And they see that as being some way of getting justice for these women and effectively closing the cases.
A pluses all round, you would have thought. Sociology class, done and dusted. Great job, team. Back to your other lessons. But incredibly, after all of that, the class continued, albeit with a different cohort of students. Mr. Campbell had another case for them to look at.
That's right. So I think for Alex Campbell, he realised that this was working incredibly well. I mean, beyond his wildest dreams, he says. And his students were absolutely fascinated by this. So they took a slightly different turn with a new class of students. They looked at whether a person was innocent and to free an innocent person from prison. So they researched hundreds of cases. They all looked at potential wrongful convictions, and they landed on the case of Suzanne Johnson. And she was somebody who was found guilty of murdering a 6-month-old baby who she was babysitting in California. And she was convicted and she was sentenced to 25 years in prison. But they looked at this case and they felt very strongly that she hadn't done it.
And why did they settle on her, though? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, it wasn't a Tennessee case, like the murders that the previous class had done.
Yes, I asked them that as well. And I said, why her?
There was just a lot of deficiencies in the way that her trial was carried out and a lot of information that just didn't seem quite right as far as the evidence that was presented. And we just felt like there was something missing that needed to be reevaluated. And there was a lot of other ones that just didn't have that same, they didn't pull at our hearts as much. But that one really stuck out to everybody in the class.
They really felt that her case was strong and that she should not be in prison. And they felt that there was ways of proving that she was innocent, as she had insisted all along.
So class 1 for Mr. Campbell was solving cold cases. His difficult second album was, okay, let's turn this on its head and let's get a different cohort of students to try and prove someone's innocent. I imagine the skills and the methods are quite different. So how do they actually approach this?
So what they did was they looked very carefully at the case itself, all of the documentation around it, and they became fascinated with the science of the case, the science which the prosecutors said proved she murdered this child.
We worked alongside a couple medical classes and things in Elizabethton at the high school. So they helped explain and helped all of us understand the medical aspect of her case.
Now, Suzanne Johnson always insisted that what happened was that the 6-month-old baby fell from her high chair and she was initially fine, but then started having seizures. She called 911, the emergency services, and had them come and take her away, and she died shortly afterwards. Now, the prosecutors back then, they argued that a baby could not have actually had these injuries in a fall, that it wasn't at all possible, and they thought that Suzanne had shaken the child and killed her.
Because the prosecution basically stated the only way that a child that age can sustain retinal hemorrhaging, I think it was, is through shaken baby syndrome, and we found that was completely false.
There's now new science which proves that some of the injuries that she had were indeed compatible with a fall and actually more likely to come from a fall than from being shaken. So they got all this information, and that's what they built their case on.
In what way? How did they do that?
So they began lobbying the governor of California almost daily. They were sending letters to him. Initially, it was somebody called Jerry Brown, and then it became Gavin Newsom. He's actually the current governor of California. So they were writing letters to him. They got involved with the Innocence Project, which is a charity that works with a lot of suspected wrongful convictions. They passed all of their research onto them, which they said was incredibly helpful. And they were tweeting the governor. They were calling his office the whole time. They were so involved in this. And actually, it did begin to bear fruit because in 2020, Gavin Newsom, governor of California, actually released her from prison.
Wow. Oh, gosh. And that was, I guess you can say, largely, entirely due to the students' efforts?
Yes, well, I spoke to Suzanne Johnson myself, and she, from California, I spoke to her in a very noisy cafe on a Zoom call.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can. I'm sorry if there's background noise.
And for her, it started. She told me the story of how she was teaching other prisoners in this prison in California about self-help and about how to deal with their situation. She came back and she had a massive stack of letters from the post room.
And so I went to the officer station, and when I got there, they gave me this whole stack of mail, and I thought, what in the world is this? And it's, at Christmas time, it's pretty emotional.
All of these were Christmas cards from this class in Tennessee. And that's how she first knew that people were interested in her case. I spoke to Suzanne's brother as well. He is a retired bus driver from Michigan, and he said, you get a bit skeptical over the years about people who say they're going to help your case, and you often get so disappointed.
A lot of people will get on board and then drop off, and then you don't see or hear from them again. But they were very persistent, and it was amazing.
But he quickly realized that these students were really, really remarkable and committed to this. And they both think that the students played a huge part in getting her free from prison.
There was so much support from them. And the fact that they had done the research that they did and were so involved in it, I'm sure that had to impress the governor or had to have some bearing on his decision.
Did all the students pass their class, do we know?
They were very, very good students, yes. So I think they passed with flying colours.
And it's been a few years now since some of these projects began, and specifically in the case of the red-headed murders that you mentioned at the beginning, their work continues to bear fruit. So how do some of the students reflect on this incredible experience and what they managed to achieve, and also what they managed to see, which most students wouldn't see about the kind of communities and world that they live in?
Yes. So actually that was something that I asked the students.
Did it cause you guys kind of like sleepless nights? I mean, did it weigh on you? Yeah.
It's made me, it's definitely, I don't want to say paranoid, but just more cautious.
Right.
More mindful of the things I do, for sure. Mm-hmm. Just in general. I've always kind of been a more paranoid person because I've always been into true crime.
Yeah, too much true crime.
But seeing how easy...
They feel that they are a little bit more questioning, perhaps, of people. Alex Campbell said, look, this is not a bad thing, because if I've stopped one of these kids from getting into the car of someone that they probably shouldn't, then that's work well done. But they also think that it's made them grateful for every day that they have, because they realize how valuable life is, how precious it is.
It just, it is crazy to think about, because it just makes me, the older I've got, I sound like an old man, but the older I've got, the more I appreciate life in and of itself. To be thankful that, us as young adults finding our way into the world, we're very thankful that we get to wake up every time we do, breathing, with families that care about us and friends that care about us and loved ones that care about us. We get to wake up breathing, and we get to live another day.
And they're very grateful for this experience. They realize that it's not a normal class, but they can't believe that they did this. And one of the students, Mason Peterson, he said to me that, he's now working in a local restaurant, but he said that he sometimes tells his co-workers Did I ever tell you about the time that I solved a cold case and found a serial killer?
Even when I'm like playing games with my friends now, or I'm like at work, I'm like, hey, did I ever tell you guys that I had a hand in solving a murder case? Everybody looks at me like I'm crazy.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
They're like, no, you didn't. I'm like, dude, I'm not even lying.
And you're going to have that for life.
Yeah.
I mean,
no one's just going to believe us. That's just going to be the thing. But, like, we know that we all did it.
If nothing else, it's a weapons-grade anecdote for them in later life, isn't it? Perfect icebreaker. Thanks to Harriet Alexander. You can read her full story on the Tennessee Wonder Sleuths at thetimes.co.uk if you have a subscription. This episode was produced by Taryn Siegel, the executive producer is Kate Ford, and sound design is by Taryn Siegel with theme tune by Mauro Seto. Let us know what you made of today's story, leave a review wherever you're listening to us, or you can fire us off an email. The story at thetimes.co.uk is where you'll find us. Goodbye.